are so fortunate to have three people here to talk to us about the archaeological dig happening at the Ida Bay Preserve. The first person I want to talk about is Dr. Bob Jeske. There's a lot of big words in here, so bear with me. Dr. Jeske's research includes archaeological method and theory, particularly how economics and population interactions foster group identity and ethnicity. Hang on. I told you there's a lot of words. He also actively investigates stone tool production and use, survey methods and settlement models, mortuary studies, canine activities, site formation processes, and experimental archaeology. Dr. Jeske has performed field work in Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, New Mexico, and Ireland. He's currently collaborating on a number of interrelated projects with colleagues and students using radiocarbon, lithic, ceramic, copper, osteological, and environmental data to clarify the culture, history, and lifeways in the Western Great Lakes region. Dr. Jeske is involved in public archaeological and historic preservation and has worked with government, nonprofit, tribal, and private organizations to use archaeology to serve the public interest. I got through it. We also have Mr. Randy Dickson here. He's been a professional archaeologist since the 1980s, and his company, Midwest Archeological Consultants, has conducted archaeological investigations on over 2,100 projects through the Midwest. His research interests include archaeological site formation processes and spatial analysis, prehistoric environmental adaptation, Paleo-Indian site spatial distribution, lithic economy and the construction of watercraft, historic preservation, and instructing middle school students in archaeology. Like, that's the hardest thing to do, right? Middle school students, are you kidding me? Mr. Dickson is the chairperson of the Public Outreach Committee of the Wisconsin Archaeological Survey. And we also, oh no, not my second page. We also have Kagan Karinga here with us. Kagan is, what is your title at Crossroads?
Interpretive naturalist.
Interpretive naturalist at Crossroads at Big Creek. I'm sure you all are familiar with Kagan because it seems like she's everywhere all the time. But she's going to talk to us a little bit too about what is happening out at the Ida Bay Preserve. So at this time, I would welcome the three of you to please come up and share your findings with us. Thank you so much.
All right. We at Crossroads of Big Creek acknowledge First Peoples, who were the original inhabitants of the region, having ancient historical and spiritual connections to the land and waters we now steward. Now, I'm proud to say that Crossroads was into caring for historical sites and indigenous people long before we started having acknowledgement statements. In fact, even before Crossroads became a 501c3 organization, back when we were a school forest, we had an archaeological dig done before we put in our parking lot and our learning center. And the archaeologist who did that dig is right here today, Vicki Durst. So, Vicki, thank you for getting us started. And because of that, from then on, I'm going to skip whole lots of stories because I want Dr. Bob to be most of the lecture. But we started, anytime we did any disturbance of the land at Crossroads, we would have an archaeological survey done. And to do that, we had a company called Midwest Archeological Consultants come out. And so Randy Dickson is the owner and principal investigator from that thing. Now, for Ida Bay, the story of Ida Bay goes back to the Ice Age. Because anybody who knows me knows that I'm absolutely obsessed with the Ice Age. And we received the Ida Bay Preserve from the Nature Conservancy. They transferred the land to Crossroads, and they transferred it in December. So everything was covered with snow, and I would go out there and I think, geez, these are great, beautiful trees. I'm so glad we saved this land. And then the snow melted, and I realized we saved 60 acres of invasive species. But we're working on that. When the snow melted, I realized there were some very interesting terraces at Ida Bay. And because I'm obsessed by the glaciers, I strongly suspected that they were the shorelines of post-glacial lakes. So I called Randy and I said, I have this gut feeling that we've got a bunch of post-glacial lake shorelines. And I happen to know that the first people very often would make their encampments by water. So if we had 3 or 4 different shorelines on the property, maybe there were some artifacts that could happen. And I called Randy, and he and one of his field techs came up. And what was it, Randy? Second shovelful?
Yeah, second shovel test.
They pulled up, what, 100 pieces of broken pottery?
200.
200 pieces of broken pottery in second shovel. And I realized that Ida Bay was more than just 60 acres of forest. It was sacred land. And with that, I want to introduce Dr. Bob. I won't tell you, there are all sorts of gyrations how I got mixed up with all these archaeologists. And if you want to know about all these stories, I'll tell you later. Right now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Bob so he can tell you about what we've been doing. And I will say, put in a word for my board of directors. Last year, they made a proclamation, sort of what do you call it, a memorandum of understanding that humanities is really a part of our restoration project. And I didn't even know there was such a thing as an environmental historians, and I guess now I am one. So, Dr. Bob, you can talk from here on in.
Thank you. Is this working? Yeah. Okay, good. I never use one of these things because I have a big mouth, but I'll do so now. And just wanted to say, thank you for inviting us out here. And there are a lot of acknowledgments to give around for the work that we've been doing. Randy's been working at these sites. When Connie said she wanted me to talk about Ida Bay, I basically said I couldn't just do that, and I needed to throw in a lot of context. So I'm going to be giving you some context. And then when we do question and answers, hopefully you'll have lots of question and answers that Randy and Connie and I can answer with more specifics about the sites themselves. So with that, I'm going to try and work multiple pieces of technology at the same time. So history and archaeology are actually very different things, even though we both studied the past. This is one of the most famous quotes about what archaeology is. It's from Indiana Jones. This is archaeology is a search for fact, not truth. If it's truth you're interested in, Dr. Tyree's philosophy class is right down the hall. So for getting ideas you got about lost cities, exotic travel, and digging up the world, we do not follow maps to buried treasure, and X never ever marks the spot. That's just before they find a great big X on the floor in Indiana Jones. So, since the new Indiana Jones movie is coming out soon, I figured I might as well throw that in there. But the biggest difference between history and archaeology, and there used to be major historians and archaeologists used to squabble about this in press, and there were things whether you were a historical archaeologist or whether you were an historian or whatever. But the main thing is that archaeology is really concerned about the masses of people who aren't recorded generally by historical texts. If you think of historians as largely working with texts and documents. So the mass, 99% of human population that's lived has never been recorded. And so what archaeology does is try to reconstruct what those people whose lives were like. And so basically, essentially, the point is that 99% of all human activity happened before we had writing, but people without writing still have a knowable past. And the thing that's evolved in archaeology since I started doing archaeology 40-something years ago is 50 years ago, is that it's become common to equate history with literacy. And so we used to talk about prehistoric people versus historic people. And there's a historic period in Wisconsin. So you go through these different periods so you get to historic. And we still fall prey to this. nowadays we try to talk about, in archaeology in the United States, we usually try to talk about contact versus pre-contact, rather than history versus history. Because even people who don't have writing have a history. So these are just a few things I'm trying to kind of clarify. Archaeologists are subject to all the same kind of critiques as you do with other disciplines. People like myself, I'm very biased, a very particular point of view of things, and so I look at things in a particular way, just like all of us do. And so our research is always biased by the way we live and what we think. But the archaeological record is really a very democratic record, because everybody leaves material culture behind. Everybody eats, everybody lives in houses, everybody does things in life that leaves behind a record. And so this little kid's book called Everyone Poops, it's a very popular child's book now. Essentially, thankfully everyone poops and everyone breaks things and everybody leaves garbage behind. And that's what archaeologists do. And what I want to point out here is that archaeologists, we always talk about culture, but it's important to remember that when I talk about culture, or Randy talks about culture, we're talking about the things that are up here. And when we get done talking, which I got like 2 hours, right? Tops, no more than 2 minutes. When we get done talking up here, we've got some artifacts and the sites laid out, so please feel free to come up and take a look, and we can talk about those. But it's important to understand that when archaeologists talk about culture, we're not necessarily talking about human culture. So pots aren't people is a very common phrase. And what that means is, when I talk about, and I'm going to throw out terms like Lake Woodland, and Middle Woodland, and North Bay. These things are terms that archaeologists use to talk about material culture. But there wasn't anybody up here who called themselves the North Bay people. Okay? That's something that we've made up in our head. Unlike with historians, where you can talk about, we can talk about the English, or we can talk about the Germans, we can talk about the Chinese. These were entities that we have literary evidence for. Most of the people that we talk about in archaeology, we don't have that. And so we're putting together these terms that don't necessarily correlate exactly with the human beings who lived at that time. But it's the closest we can get for communication. So I'm going to skip over that and just talk about the fact that archaeologists use multiple approaches to get to our stories. Because that's eventually what we want to get to here, is a story. And we use humanistic ways, we use scientific methods, we use social scientific methods, and we use what we call multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary ways to go about doing this. So the first and most important set of people that archaeologists work with are other archaeologists. Again, I mentioned Indiana Jones is coming out. Most of us don't run around in leather jackets and whips and excavate sites all by ourselves or whatever. It doesn't happen very much anymore. Although I do wear a lot of leather and I do own a bullet, but that's that's a whole other talk. But well, as you can see, we do all kinds of things. We work in the field. We work by pulling out what we call material culture. And all material culture is the stuff that people throw away. Essentially, we go through people's garbage. Okay? We get the garbage that people leave behind. And it's a very important, but it's only a partial part of their lives. Just like a historical text only gives you so much information, people's garbage only gives you so much information. But we can work on the garbage. And so here you can see various people that we've worked with over the years, doing different kinds of recording and excavation techniques to get at people's garbage. And then we spend a lot of time, as you can see in the bottom corner here, sitting around talking about it and trying to figure out how we go from the garbage to the behaviors and the beliefs behind that garbage. And these are the kind of things we pull up out of the ground. We pull up pottery and antler tools and various kinds of stone tools. And this mess of stuff here is from a very fine sieving technique. And what you're seeing here is a bunch of fish bone, primarily. A little fish vertebra here and here. There's a little, that's a little waterfowl end of the bone there. There's a little piece of pottery. But we try to collect not just large things, but we do soil sampling and collect really tiny things. We get all kinds of different kinds of data. We also work with historians on a regular basis from, if you're working in the old world where you've got cuneiform and papyrus and Chinese writers and so on, we get lots of great information on that can be can be attached to your archaeological. For example, here in Door County, we can look at plat maps and census figures, and we can look at blueprints and so on to work with more modern types of things. For archaeologists, the past is happening right now. So everything we do. It used to be people would think archaeology was just ancient stuff. The fact is, we work with everything all the way up to what I was just talking about just now. It just happened. Past just happened. Okay. So, but we also work with biologists. One of the things we do is called zooarchaeology, which isn't just animal bone. And so here you can see, right here, a line. All these are fish scales that were deposited in a garbage pit 1,000 years ago, and those scales are from a drum fish. And from that, we can talk about what people were eating. We can reconstruct the environment. We know what kind of water sources they were working with. We can get seasonality. We can look at fish scales. We can tell whether it was a spring fish or a fall fish. Here's a vertebra from a bison that we found over at, this is another side I was working at Lake Koshinan, but one of the arguments is whether indigenous people were hunting bison in Wisconsin before like 1500 AD. And I can tell you right now that they were, because this is 1,000 years old, and no one was dragging the vertebra of a bison from across the Mississippi River all the way over to southeastern Wisconsin. So there were bison here in Wisconsin earlier than most people think, and Native Americans were in fact a few less. These two guys here are my dogs, and I put them there just because they're really cute. This is Todd next. By the way, I should point out that thank you for the wonderful biographical introduction, but basically, and thank you very much, I look at bones and stones. That's cut short. I study bones and stones and dig square holes in the ground and look at people's garbage. But I also have a special interest in what dogs do and how they affect the archaeological record, which is a lot, actually. But that's Todd and Max. So other types of biology we look at is paleobotany. And it turns out that people use and are surrounded by plants all the time. And we look at pollen and phytoliths. Phytoliths are the backbone of plants, essentially. And when a plant dies, the organic material goes away, but the little pieces of silica which they take up in groundwater that they incorporate into their cells gets left behind. And if you look at the soil samples with a microscope, you can see these different little pieces of silica that were plant cells. And you can look at the species of plant that was being used at the site. So same thing with pollen. We can look at pollen. So that's microbotanical stuff. But we can also look at macrobotanical. We get particularly charred remains of wood, nuts, and seeds. And from all that, again, we can get things like season of use of the site. We can look at whether what people were eating. We can look at the technology that they use to process their foods. So biology is very important to us. Also looking at human remains themselves are important to us archaeologists. And again, some people call it osteology. There's human paleontology, which is evolution. But again, we can look at what people ate. We can look at what kind of diseases they had. We can look at trauma. And we can look at the evolution of humans. All from looking at skeletal materials, but also by looking at different kinds of isotopes, different kinds of heavy metals that get left behind. It turns out you really are what you eat. And when you die, a lot of what you've done in your life is encoded in your bones. And archaeologists often spend a lot of time doing exactly that, looking at the bones of people to get a good idea of what they did in their lives. Geology is really important to us because archaeological sites are a combination of the behaviors and the material that people left behind and the way they get deposited. So geology is really important. So geomorphology and soils analysis are important for how, this is just taking a sample through a site to get a look at how soils were deposited. This is a colleague of mine, now retired, as a geographer who works with limestone. He was looking at the limestone underneath an archaeological site that actually the same formation, the Niagara Formation, down in just south of Door County, coming up to here. Chemistry, we work with chemists a lot because we can do things like radiocarbon dating, and we can get the dates from archaeological sites. We can look at ancient DNA and get a look at the genetics of people and animals. And we can do what we call stable isotope analysis, I just mentioned, the bones. We can take bone samples, not just from humans, but from the animals that they used. One of my students used dog remains to get a look at what the dogs were eating, because the dogs essentially eat what their partners, what their owners eat. And so he could look at the change in diet through time by looking at change in bone chemistry of dogs. In physics, we do things like remote sensing. This is the Cove site just out, just away from Ida Bay. And here you can see an aerial photograph. Here's a little excavation right there. But here you can see it under LiDAR, which is a fancy kind of radar that allows us to get a very close order look at the surface of the ground. And this tells us that we probably had a small stream that flowed through here at one point that no longer exists today. So we can get some really interesting information from physics. And then we use computer science, lots of stuff we could never do before. Now you can do with computer analysis very quickly. So, and lots of other disciplines. As Oscar Wilde said, indeed, archaeology is only really delightful when infused with some kind of art. So, I'm going to do a real quick talk about woodland occupations. And here, this is from the glaciers to today, and I'm only going to talk about this little tiny period right in here. We're skipping all this other stuff, right in here. And this goes from about, let's say, 2,000 years ago to about 500 years ago. And the woodland period, which these two sites are middle and late woodland. Archaeologists like make everything in threes. So there's an early, a middle, and a late. If you've ever read any articles about Egypt, it's the early, middle, and late kingdom. It's the old versus the new dynasty. But we tend to do it in three: early, middle, and late. Classic, pre-classic, post-classic. From about 100 BC to AD 1200. And Ida Bay and the Cove sites, which are side by side, only about a half mile apart, Randy, roughly.
Yeah.
They cover this time period. And here what we're doing is people are going from being foragers, that is almost all wild foods, to where they're adding domesticated foods into the diet during this time period. It's a very important time period. They're settling down, they're using pottery, and they're known for mounds. Although we don't have much in the way of mounds around here, burial mounds. But across most of the eastern United States, this is a time period where people are putting their dead in mounds. And here's Great Lakes. Here's one of the words we can throw out: North Bay. The middle woodland time period is usually referred to as North Bay. If you go south, they call it the Waukesha phase, which I thought I fixed, but I misspelled. Trempealeau, Utica. These are just words that lay out regional differences. Well, these guys down here were all involved in a very complicated trade network that spanned the entire continent. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from up north, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, shark's teeth, and so on. those were being traded all through down here. You get to here, nothing. Doesn't happen. Up in this area, they were not part of what was going on down here too much. They were oriented north. In Door County, there's a whole series of woodland sites, and what we find is that you get these large, conical, very thick pots. We get projectile points that are not precisely beautifully made, as you'll see up here, but they tend to be contracting stemmed or have these little notches on them. But they make up a recognizable set that says that these are North Bay, and this comes from about 500 BC to about 8400. And this is a reconstructed vessel from a site just 20 miles north of us here, called the Heritage Site. And you can see there these kind of almost flower pot looking things. And again, just more of these kind of not very pretty. And oh, by the way, I mentioned we dig in people's garbage. So what you'll notice is I'm showing you pictures of is not a lot of stuff you see in museums, really long, big, pretty, great stuff, but it's all broken. We got bottoms, we got tops, but most of these are busted. As archaeologists, we make almost all of our decisions about what people were doing from busted up stuff. We don't get the pristine things. We usually get stuff that's broken. So if we look at Ida Bay, and I'm only going to talk for a minute so that we can get this taken care of, but it's really important to understand that Ida Bay was excavated over the years using a combination of professionals like Randy and a number of techs, a couple of old friends here, and then kids. Kids were involved in all of this, and public outreach is an important part of that, and I'll let Randy and Kyle talk more about that. But as a site, you can see how we do this. We usually dig in squares or rectangles for ease of recording, but you can see that the site's you don't have to go down very far. Ida Bay is very shallow, and after about 20 or 30 centimeters, roughly, a foot and a half or so, you're at the bottom. You're at glacial deposits. And however, it is chock full of artifacts. So these are North Bay ceramics. This is this post shovel test that we're talking about. We have those materials up here. This is North Bay. There's a little tiny projectile point as well. But plenty of material came out of this that puts the Ida Bay site primarily as this North Bay site that we're currently working on getting radiocarbon dates for. The problem is that it's expensive, and we're always looking for money. If you're ever interested in finding out things like dates and so on, let us know. We can always use a little money for radiocarbon dates and other types of work with these geologists and physicists and so on. Randy and I are cheap, but these scientist guys are expensive. But these are the types of tools that have come out of that site. This is a little copper awl, a little piercing tool. These are different types of projectile points that one can look at and go, okay, that's North Bay, that fits. And here's kind of a cool thing. I know it doesn't look that cool. It's just a little circular spherical piece. But the material that is made of comes from the Ohio River Valley at the Illinois-Indiana border. So when I mentioned that our guys up here, these North Bay culture, wasn't participating much in that big trade network, it wasn't that they were completely isolated, because someone brought something up from about, 400, 500 miles south of us to this side.
What is that?
It's a core. It's simply used for removing flakes to be used as tools. So it itself, people would hit it and get it. Now, it doesn't mean it can't be used as well, because once you get an edge on it like that, then yes, then it can be used as a scraper. And we find that many, many, many tools are used for multiple purposes. So things that people call a projectile point or an arrow point are often used as knives, as scrapers. things that I call a core for the removal of flakes often then get used as scrapers or as wedges. And we do this, we know this because we can do high-powered microscopy to look at edge damage and residue. And in fact, the tools that we have up here have all been looked at for both blood residue and for high-power microscopy. One of my former students, who's now a professor at Towson University in Maryland, did the high-power analysis for us. And we know that a number of these tools are used for scraping and piercing and so on. And we know that some of the tools are used on beaver, some on rabbit, and so on. This lifeway of that we find is the North Bay folks working on begins to change, and about after 8400 or so, we call it up here, it's called Hines Creek. And again, Hurricane Kokoski phase down in southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois, we got the Des Plaines, but up in this area we call it Hines Creek. And again, you'll find that in general in Wisconsin, and Vicki or Randy, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but just about any woodland site is going to have early and late materials on it, just at different proportions, typically speaking. But so the same kind of sites where we find materials at the North Bay, we find Hines Creek with. And here we get more advanced kind of pottery forms. I don't know how well you can see these. When you come up here, you can see a little bit more decorative techniques on some of these. And then the introduction of triangular and small projectile-looking points that suggest the introduction of bow and arrow at this time. We get increasing sediment, people are settling down more, and they're beginning to use horticulture, gardening. And after 80,000, we begin to see maize. So we did a little work at the Cove site, which is has a little bit more. The Ida Bay site is mostly North Bay with some Hines Creek on top of it so far. Cove site is a little bit of North Bay with more Hines Creek. So it's primarily, so they're separated by a half a mile, but the two of them combined give us over 1,000 years of data. And so we've got here's the thing that strikes fear into the heart of an old archaeologist is about 40 junior high school kids coming off the bus. But they do a really good job. They work hard and they do a really good job. But again, you can see how close these two sites are. Here's here's the Cove. There's Lake Michigan and so on. So you can see they're really quite close together here. And at this site, Randy has worked there. We've got a couple of what we call block excavations. Ida Bay is mostly smaller trenches put in, separated. But here we've got some larger excavation areas so we can get some spatial data. And you can see a little bit older material, but much of it is a little younger than this. And one of the things that you can see here, what we have are what are called features. And this is a pit that's been dug into the ground. It's relatively shallow, but you can see a lot of carbonized material here and here. And so from these pits, because they've got this nice context, we can take samples out of those, and these are really good for getting radiocarbonating and so on. Or what we've been doing is getting radiocarbonates off of the sherds. Food residue that's left on the inside of the pottery sherds, sometimes that gets left. We can shave that off and send that in for radiocarbonated analysis. When I was a kid, when we brought in that stuff from the field, we religiously scrubbed the pots clean. And nowadays, I would die to have all that stuff. It's amazing how much stuff we threw out there. So we're really careful about not washing things too much nowadays. So, but you can see that the ceramics are a little different. With these kind of little flanged tips, some decorations, and again, you can get a look at some of that when you get up here. But we've got some antler and bone tools from the site. And then, as I mentioned, you get some of these, what look to be now arrow points, some small triangular points, some larger tools that are probably used as knives and scrapers as well. And so to sum up my part of it here, what's happening is The two sites together tell us very much that people were going from a foraging lifestyle to a gardening lifestyle. That bow and arrow technology comes in probably about 8600, but we need a lot more dates for that. They're using deer, fish, wild plants, probably maize after about 1000. They are still maintaining mobility and flexibility. They're moving around the landscape. I'm going to show you a really confusing slide to finish up with. But one of the things that is true is that they're socially oriented to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. A lot of the material that they're using for stone tools is Michigan materials coming from the Upper Peninsula instead of down south. Or it's very local. There's two kinds of local cherts that people use for tools. One's called Makokata, one's called Silurian, and those dominate our assemblages here. But some of the materials that we're finding that we don't recognize are Michigan, I'm pretty sure. So, just really quick, I just wanted to do this. All those sites that are going up and down the peninsula, this is summer, autumn, winter, and spring. And just think of these people are moving around seasonally for the most part. And so in the summer you get berries and fruits and generalized hunting. In the autumn you get hard shell nuts and migrating waterfowl and deer. In the winter you get elk and steer hunting, still hunting of deer. In the spring we get spawning fish, and people can go and get chert resources. And these are the sites, North Bay site, the Cove site, the Merrill site, Hines Creek, Ida Bay site. These are sites that show evidence of being used during these seasonal movements. So it's not like people are just, when we find an archaeological site, people are just settling down in one spot and living there all of their lives for 1,000 years. What's happening is we're getting a complex movement of people from one site to the other. And one of the things that needs to be done still to this day is a synthesis of all of the archaeological sites from these time periods up and down the Door Peninsula. There's been some good work done in individual sites, but at this point we need to figure out exactly how all these sites from these different sites fit into these different kinds of activities. So that makes it a little bit more complicated. And then I'll just finish up here. It's traditional to end up with a sunset. I've yet to take a good sunset picture out at the sites. I'm just a lousy photographer apparently, but that's as close as I can. So thank you for that, and I hope I at least set some context. Randy, you want to come on up and we'll do some questions and answers? Less than 2 hours.
I will add that Bob likes digging at the cove a lot more because it's easier to dig. We can keep the units, the floors flat and the walls vertical. Digging at Ida Bay is a nightmare. The rocks, it jam your shoulder when you're digging. And the roots and the rocks are just horrible. We can't get a flat floor to save our lives there. So it's quite a bit different. I like both sites a lot. We found, back up a little bit, Ida Bay, we found that in 2015, as Coggan informed you earlier, Crossroads acquired the 64-acre property of Ida Bay, went out with Willie Kemps, one of my field techs, archaeologists, and we got so excited when we saw the different lake levels, real beaches. So what we're digging on is just beneath this, right off of the road, just beneath the Lake Algoma shoreline. It's about 610 feet, give or take 5 feet. And that's where the site is. We have some of the site up top, and where we have those 200 pieces of property, about 200 yards to the south and east of the main site at Ida Bay. And this has been really a fascinating experience to be out there digging and teaching the kids out there doing public outreach on these two sites. And this is going to be our 10th year this year we're doing this. Now we've gone from, we're at 4th graders on to 8th graders now. Do you have any questions about either the Cove site or Ida Bay site, anything.
I have a question, since Bob talked about dogs, has there been evidence of dogs at either of these sites?
No, we don't have any evidence of canines yet.
We don't have a lot of bone from these sites, overall.
Yeah. Ida Bay is very shallow. We can only get down about a foot and a half. Down into that rock. That's really tough digging.
I don't know if I missed this when you're talking about the different disciplines. Do you use DNA at all to, and can you tell the difference between a 1,000-year-old bone and a, I don't know, 500-year-old bone, or is there any progression?
Yeah, we do, DNA analysis is one of those things that is an up-and-coming field. They're still working on ancient DNA and how that works. But yeah, you can now look at the material from a human skeleton, pull the genome out and compare it. It's not a straight genealogy, but you can look and get an idea of the relationships of, say, folks from one region to another. And you can look at how old something is by the amount of mutations you get from a modern. In North America, people haven't been here long enough to do much of that. Almost all indigenous people of North and South America look incredibly similar to each other in terms of that, because it's been a relatively short time that people have been here. But you can tell that there have been at least 3 different migrations from Asia into North and South America because of the differences in the DNA. The DNA that they're doing now really conforms very nicely to earlier linguistic and other archaeological data as well.
What's the criteria do you use when you select a site? There's obviously a lot more sites around our county than what you have on your map there. And so how do you, is it just because the cool land is there and you can utilize it, or?
I think there are about 500 recorded sites in Door County right now with this Wisconsin Historical Society. And I'm sure there are hundreds and hundreds more that just haven't been recorded yet. But those are the officially recorded sites. This is, Ida Bay is a DR35, 47 DR35, which is the state site inventory. And the Cove site is DR14. So there are a lot of sites. I will back up a little bit and tell you how we found the Cove site. You're asking about site discovery, kind of. So what we did is, my field tech Willie was going out on like the 2nd or 3rd day to work in Ida Bay. And Crossroads just bought the 9.5 acre property the Cove is located on, and the groundskeeper cleared honeysuckle off of it. So there's a bare ground, it was raining, 100 by 100 foot area. So Willie got out of his truck and walked it, and he just called me, he was shaking, and said, Randy, we got an awesome site here, come on out. And I came out with a bunch of pin flags, and we put down 500 pin flags on artifacts in 100 by 100 feet.
What's a pin flag?
Pin flag is a little flag with an orange piece of tape on it. And so we could mark all these concentrations of where the artifacts were. There are arrowheads, there's bone, there's fire cracked rock, there's pottery, and most of all it's the flakes of the quokka and the splurring chert that Bob spoke of earlier. And those are the 2 main chert types, stone tool types that they're making.
If I can jump in, he's talking about that very calmly right now. They weren't exactly calm when they called them.
Yeah, it was a pretty exciting time. Yes?
So my question, you kind of answered it there. The finding that was actually a surface finding.
Yeah.
Is I'm not sure how much farming was done in that area. Do you know if there's been a history of finds over the years by residents finding, debitage or, actual projectile points themselves?
Yeah, where the cove site is right now, it was farmed before because we have plow scars on the ground when we were excavating down. We could see the plow bore south. And it was definitely farmed, and we have people in the area that remember being farmed before, so it was under the plow, sure.
I just want to come back to your question. You asked about criteria for why we sites that we dig and so on. So one of the slides I skipped over at the beginning were goals of archaeology. One of the goals of archaeology is to conserve the archaeological record, because archaeological sites, archaeology is destructive. When we excavate a site, we destroy the site. Okay? Once we dig a hole, what's left is a hole, and we've got a bunch of stuff out here. Well, that site's now gone, just as if you just taken a bulldozer and run through it. So what we need to do as archaeologists is to conserve sites so that we only excavate as much as we can. So we save more for later. We don't want to destroy an entire site. So we rarely dig more than a few percent of any one site. Because someone 50 years, 100 years from now is going to discover that, oh, maybe you shouldn't scrub the gunk off the back of the shirt. So now you go back and you can dig up the rest of that site and go, oh, here's shirts that don't have everything clean. So we want to save stuff for later. So archaeology, nowadays, a site usually gets excavated only for one of two good reasons. But because also we've dug up so much stuff over the years that you could probably take care of every archaeology PhD in this country. They could write their dissertation for the next 10 years without excavating another archaeological site at all. There's enough material sitting out there. But one reason we do it is because of what's called cultural resource management or historic preservation laws. And there are several of them, and Randy can talk to them more than me at this point. But the other is if we have a new question that we need new kinds of data. Otherwise, we tend to try and leave archaeological sites. We just don't do. So, for example, public outreach. We'd love to educate kids in how archaeology works. It's not ethical for us, though, to just go out and dig a site to teach kids how to dig. You have to have a research question because you're destroying the site. So either you have to have a good research question and you're educating people, or it's excavating before the site gets destroyed by government action. And either on the state level or the federal level are different historic preservation laws. So sometimes it's mandated by law, other times you've got to have a really good reason to do it. You just can't go and dig sites willy-nilly. So there are criteria that we do use.
In addition, we don't have the time, energy, or money to dig on the sites we want to dig.
Definitely not the time.
Get where our bodies are getting worn out too. I just got a new shoulder, you just got a new knee. Yes.
What do these folks do with their dead? Other Indians or indigenous people have mounds and whatever, and you guys can find fish bones and deer antlers 1,000 years old. Where are the bodies? I mean, they lived here 1,000 years. There must be thousands of people buried here unless they had some sort of crematory.
Yeah. Well, this guy is a burial rights relative.
Beads too. I mean, what ornaments would they?
Sure. So with regards to the mortuary treatment varies a lot through time, and in sometimes people were buried in organized cemeteries, but because people up here were moving around a lot, people died were often just buried in relatively small numbers. So archaeologically, we don't see them a lot. But other times, people would come together on that seasonal round map. There are places where they did indeed build mounds. And people would come, probably bringing they would lay people out and let them decay, and then gather the bones up, put them in a bag, and then deposit that bag of bones together seasonally. So you come to like an autumn harvest festival, and you bring with you a bag with your uncle and your cousin or whatever, and lay them together. And then often those would be put over on a small mountain. In the time period of North Bay and the Hines Creek, you have small, conical, round mounds. And then just to the south of us, we have what's called the effigy mounds. Wisconsin is home to tens of thousands of mounds that are in the shape of animals and geometric shapes. I don't think we have effigy mounds. There's not much in the way of effigy mounds up here, are there?
No,
Right?
some small conical ones.
Some small, yeah. So, but where most of it's an interesting question. I can tell you that it's the same problem we have with the Romans. It's the same problem we have with all Iron Age people in Europe. It looks like sometimes they're cremating people, other times they're leaving people out, and they're just letting them let nature take its course. Because if you look at a number of cultures around the world at different times, you'll see there are no human remains for the number of people we know are out there. And up here, in that time period that we're talking about right now, I would argue, yeah, you're right. We don't have nearly the evidence for burials as we might expect. Yes, sir.
Going back to what you said about government making a requirement for archaeological digs, when they put in the four-lane highway, there were several digs down in Joe County because of that.
Yep. Randy worked on that project, the 57 project, Highway 57.
That was in 2000 to 2004. That's when I met my wife and how I'm still here.
And we're still working on the materials from those excavations. UWM did a lot of that work, and a company called Great Lakes Archaeological Research Center did a lot of the work. Well, I don't know what other firms worked on that particular project, but they did, yes, a lot of work, in a number of PhD and master's theses have been written on the materials that were excavated during that government-mandated excavation of Highway 57.
If you're not finding a lot of human remains, would that tend to reflect that this was not a region with a lot of warring parties? A lot of conflict between groups?
Well, actually, we do have some evidence of conflict up here. So they probably had some, when you're moving around the landscape, sometimes you bump into your neighbors, and sometimes it works out okay, and sometimes you have conflict over resources. And it turns out that by 80, 1,000, we definitely have evidence for some kind of aggression, and that's true all over the Midwest. Yes.
So when I was growing up, I used to work on a nursery that had a bunch of fields, and you'd find arrowheads out there. And one thing that always bothered me was how many of those darn arrowheads did they shoot that you could be walking through a 40-acre field, and pick them up here and there every now and then. I mean, you don't find 30-06 bullets laying around anymore nowadays, but these arrowheads, did you ever figure out the density over a spatial?
Sure. So the question is, how come we find so many of these, projectile points, arrowheads, spear points, whatever you want to call them, and they're just kind of laying around all over the place, although they do tend to cluster in places. But the way to think about them is to think about your razor. So nowadays we all have disposable razors. You do a few shaves and you throw them away. But when I first started shaving, you had a razor, and you'd buy these little thin razor blades. You put in Wilkinson, yes, steel blades, right? And you use those for 4, 5, 6 times, whatever, and then you throw that blade out. So for every one person who was shaving in a household over the course of 20 years, you'd have hundreds or thousands of razor blades that got disposed of somewhere, right? So when you look at a spear or an arrow, the expensive part of the spear or arrow is the shaft. It's not the point. You can make a really useful projectile point if you want to make just one that's just functional in a couple of minutes, if you want to make one that's really pretty, in an hour or so. But to straighten out a piece of wood or cane, and then to get the fletching and get on, Randy can tell you that, takes much, much longer. So, and then if you want to check me on this, you go back to old westerns, and you'll find the cavalry guy laying down on the ground with an arrow sticking out of him. And John Wayne pulls the arrow out, and he looks at it, and he goes, Comanche. Well, how does he know? He's not looking at the point, he's looking at the fletching and stuff. Because that takes a lot of work, and people put their identities into that. They put their, they put their identities onto the thing that they're going to reuse over and over again. The point, who cares? That gets lodged in the animal and disappears. So that's why, because those are disposable. The arrowheads are disposable.
Yeah, something else, I think of that continuum. There already has 6 shells or shotgun shells, 130 years on the landscape versus projectile points, 13,000 years on the landscape. There's a lot more people shooting a lot more arrows, throwing a lot more arrows. Most of the stuff is thrown with a spear. We do that out at the Cove and Ida Bay with kids. We have them. I've made some battle owls and some spears. And we throw it up. We did have a cardboard mammal target. Now we've got an actual deer target we throw at.
How long does it take you to make a spear?
It's a long time to make the spear. What it is, it's the fletching takes a while, but it's getting the shaft straight. And once it gets humid, it starts to bend, and then you got to heat it. And you put this tool over it. It's called a wrench. It's just made out of a piece of bone with a hole in it. You heat it up, and then you tweak the shaft, and you do the same thing on an arrow shaft. It's a lot of maintenance. A lot of maintenance is involved in arrow making and bows. I make bows out of Osage orange stripes, 45-pound, 65-pound bows, and there's a lot of maintenance going into that. And you also, if you're using those, you need to keep them dry. If you're Native American landscape, you're going to keep those things as dry as you can, because they'll start to warp, and then they don't work as well. They lose a lot of power if they're wet. There's too much humidity in the bowl.
Would one of the reasons there aren't as many balloons around as you might think, that they would put people in a raft or something and push them out to the lake?
Yeah, it's hard to find evidence that they did that unless there's something in the historical record.
Now, as far as I know, that wasn't a common practice, certainly not with any post-contact people that I can think of in the Great Lakes. Generally speaking, the most common form of burial is either in a small pit or in this defleshing scenario where you put a person up in a tree or on a scaffold, let carrying crows and so on, take all the meat away, and then collect the bones and put them in. We call these bundle burials. And those are by far the 2 most common forms of burial you'll find here in the northern part of the place. That's the best really the best answer I can give you. Yes, sir?
I don't see much on the Green Bay side. Is that a population problem?
Oh, you mean in terms of the
Well, the bays used to freeze over, and you couldn't get water.
Right. I think on the slide I was showing you, that was just a bias of me just grabbing, some of the better known excavated sites. I suspect that if we work longer on the bay site, there might be more sites, but I don't know. Randy, what do you think?
I know on this side, when I worked on the 57 corridor, that's you have the Niagara Escarpment, and you have all these springs coming out the hillsides. And that whole corridor is just loaded with sites. And one of the sites I worked on actually, when he was my professor at UWM in 2000, 2001, was the 99 to 2001. This Borderwood Village site, and that's also a North Bay site, just like what we have up here in Ida Bay.
Yeah, so I think it's mostly excavator bias that shows that. Yeah, I was going to point out Bowdoin Village is a nice example of we tend to think of these sites as being on the coast because they get found that way. That's where people are hanging out, and you get dune blowouts or you get farming and so on. Inland, you don't have, it's a little harder to find sites just in terms of material culture, but this Bowdoin Village site is the same time period as Ida Bay, but it's an inland and it's a winter site. And you can tell it's winter from the way they made the stone tools and the kind of material left behind. And then now we've got some confirmation in terms of the fish. We know it's a very early spring spawn, so it's a winter and spring site. But they're inland away from the lake and from the bay. So it's in a protected area as well. I suspect if we went up some of these creek drainages, you would find more sites like Bowdoin Village, which is probably what's going on. They're probably moving away from the lake or from the bay in the wintertime and hanging out more inland or heading south. More questions? Anybody? Yes, sir.
Were the lake water levels during the woodland pretty much typical to what they are now, or?
During the middle woodland, the lake levels were a little lower than they are now, and then the lake began to rise throughout the late woodland to about where it is today. Another thing about biases in the archaeological record is the fact that there may be many more of these North Bay sites that are underwater right now. They're just a few feet underwater because all it takes is 2 feet of water. We're not going to find the site. It gets silted over very quickly and it's gone. So, and you may have read in the newspaper or seen in your news feeds or whatever, with all the big droughts out west and down south, a whole lot of shipwrecks are coming visible now. And that's because the water levels are down. And so they're finding all kinds of new sites and new shipwrecks because of the water levels. So yeah, water level rise and fall of lakes is very important, particularly more so when we go farther back, say what we call the Archaic, let's say 3,000 to 9,000 years ago. Because there you get some major changes in water levels, and that means major changes in where people are leaving their sites, and that leaves a big bias for us in the archaeological record. No more questions? Yes?
What's the most controversial thing you revealed?
What's the most controversial thing that we've done?
Yeah, that you found, did this prove something, or?
Blood.
So, yeah, one of the things, for quite some time, there was this idea that Native Americans were peaceful, at one with the earth, and all that kind of stuff. And basically the cross was what they did instead of have warfare and so on. We now have a lot of examples where we find scalp marks. So for example, it was once thought that the French introduced scalping to Native Americans. We can demonstrate that Native Americans were scalping each other for hundreds, thousands of years before Europeans showed up. We have spear points and projectile points embedded in people's skeletons that suggest, in fact, a homicide rate that is much, much higher than current modern U.S. rates. Not in absolute terms, but as a percentage of the population. Let's say as many as 3 to 5% of the skeletons we find are documented with some kind of trauma, which is incredibly high. We think 3 to 5% of Americans die of homicide. Okay? I mean, there are 375 million people. If 3.75 million people were killed in this country every year, oh my God. It's a tiny, tiny fraction of that. So, and then now we can also we can test stone tools for blood. As I mentioned, we've got, here we got rabbit and beaver from some sites that I work in around Lake Kashima. We can demonstrate bison and deer and elk were being used. So not only we have the bones, we have the tools that were used on them, but we also have projectile points that have human blood on them. Now, that human blood could be, just like if I'm making a stone tool, I bleed all over it. I am covered in things. So it may have been the maker of the tool whose blood it is, but it may also have been that that was an arrow point that ended up in a person. So, and in fact, in Lake Koshinong, I've got 2 examples of projectile points with blood, human blood. They test positive with as if like an allergen. When you do an allergy test, they do allergy tests on the tools, and they test. We have 2 tools that tested positive for blood, but also the microwear evidence shows what's called meat polish, which meant that it was embedded in somebody's flesh for a long period of time because they had to polish the tool. So there was plenty of warfare, and not everybody likes to hear that, but we do know that there's a very high level of violence in these early societies. So I would say that's probably the most controversial thing I know.
Any other questions, or want us to expound on anything else we've already talked about?
Well, thank you very much.
That was a whole lot of information. Oh my goodness, I have so much to think about now. That was great. Thank you so much for making the trip and speaking to us today. I do want to mention that we had an anonymous donor who sponsored our speakers and appearance here today, so I want to make sure that I thank that anonymous donor as well. And also, please join us next month for our program. It will be on Saturday, March 25th. It's a luncheon again, and we will be at the Door Country Event Center. Is that what it's called? Okay. Insurance. In Southern Door, right off the highway, and we will be joined by Barb Chisholm, who will be talking to us about roadside shovels. So that'll be a great program. Make sure that you sign up for that as well. Yes?
I just want to add that we are going to be having a dig in May, and if participating in one of these digs is on your bucket list, we could make that happen.
So who should they talk to if they want to help out with the dig? Yeah, reach out to Hagen at Crossroads and she can give you all the information. So that concludes our February program. Thank you all so much for coming, and you have a wonderful rest of your Saturday.